Hello and welcome to In Focus. I'm Peter Laffin, editor of the Washington Examiner's In Focus section. Joining us today is Examiner columnist Tiana Lowe Doescher and Rachel Lowe, an associate editor at Law and Liberty. Welcome to you both.
Thank you for having us.
So I asked you both to join today because you've both written pieces for our section of late on the same topic, but with slightly different takes. And both are in response to the widely discussed Helen Andrews essay in Compact. Rachel, you seem to take issue with Helen Andrews' take on the Great Feminization that argues that female dominance in our institutions has led to dysfunction. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about that.
I think that actually this might be an interesting conversation because I'm not sure that Tiana and I disagree all that much about what is happening or should be happening. I think we disagree quite a lot about what Andrew's position is on this subject. I think that's really going to be the major source of our disagreement. So to me, it seems clear that Andrews is very opposed to gender parity in the workplace. I think she definitely thinks that groups of women, large groups of women in our institutions, especially institutions oriented towards truth or justice, are just a problem. It doesn't matter how they got there or what processes we use to select them. If you get large numbers of women in our institutions, they will wreck them. And I think that part of what she's doing here is pitching a certain kind of narrative that has great popularity with groups of people that kind of feel like they're on their back foot, feel wronged, have this sort of sense that they ought to have a higher or more dominant place in society and can't make sense of why they don't. And I think she's telling them a kind of just so story here that suggests to them they haven't really lost in some meritocratic fair competition. They're probably right to think that in a natural and well-ordered world, they would have greater status. They would be succeeding more than they are. But men in our society were sort of tricked or cajoled by women into allowing them a greater prominence in their institutions than women should really have. And that's been the source of all kinds of evils, right? This is the sole explanation we need to understand wokeness and political correctness and all kinds of problems that have arisen within our institutions. That's what I see Andrews arguing. And I think her complaints about the non-discrimination policies, affirmative action, those kinds of things, she only brings those in at the very, very end of the article after she has already clearly established, she thinks, that women are a problem in our institutions. And I think she only brings this in order to show that, in fact, men have not lost ground to women in a fair fight. They've only been sort of tricked out of holding their rightful space in society.
Tiana, what do you make of that?
I mean, it's hard to view the last, especially 20 years of how the rules in academia have been written and think that it actually has been a fair fight, right? A lot of the focus, I think, has correctly been on racial lines. There's a reason why the Supreme Court overturned affirmative action. And the fact is that if you control for objective measures of merit, things like MCAT scores or LSAT scores or SAT scores, we know that preferential treatment has been given to specifically Black students over Asian students. That's the widest disparity, right? The focus is often on white students, but we like to forget that the primary victims of affirmative action have been Asian American students. To a lesser extent, there has been a feminization of the rules. And this is where I agree with Helen, and I think for a very different reason, right? Helen Andrews and I are I think there's not a huge sliver in the Venn diagram of where we agree with each other when it comes to policy issues. I would consider myself a feminist. I think, especially from an economic perspective, it is good for women to participate in the workplace because if you're taking out half the population as an input, that is bad for an economy, right? You're putting an artificial ceiling on your economic output. That being said, Helen is saying that the rules should be fair, and I agree because I think women are capable of achieving everything that men can when the rules are completely equal. Okay, in what ways have the rules been changed? So I found this study from FIRE organization, the Free Speech Advocacy Organization, and one of the things they were trying to figure out is how much of the intolerance for campus free speech is different between the political parties or political persuasions versus specifically gender, because we know that women tend to be more liberal than men. Last night in the, off-year elections, young women, 81% of them went for Zohran Mamdani, right? It's 80% of them went for Abigail Spanberger and Mikey Sherrill. So we know that women vote overwhelmingly more Democratic right now. However, when fire controlled for political persuasion, even though liberals, and specifically those who identify as very liberal, have much less tolerance for campus speakers with whom they disagree, the real difference fire found is gender. Regardless of party or ideology, men are so much more tolerant than women that the gender tolerance gap dominates the ideology gap. In fact, men are over 3.5 times more likely than women to be perfectly tolerant of opposing views. And I do think in part, we have been hijacked by that. And campus speakers don't have much to do with whether or not you're going to succeed in a STEM major or whether or not you're going to get admissions to, a specialized high school. However, those views have trickled down in holistic applications. They have trickled down in terms of what it means to fight fair. And I don't think any of this is to do with the fact that women are inherently less than, more than it is that men have been civilized at mass scale because they exist on those further ends of the bell curve, and the male instinct, the biological instinct, is towards violence, right? There's not really an acceptable amount of violence in contemporary civilization. You cannot beat someone up at a school, right? That there are zero tolerance policies for all of that. There are very few Luigi Mangionis, and they become an incredibly big deal when they actually do use violent terrorism in order to prove a point, because that is such a rare and egregious offense. Whereas the tools that Helen describes in her piece, cancellation being foremost among them, evisceration of due process, right? There's polling that showed that women are much less tolerant of due process, specifically if you say that an allegation is a sexual assault. Those I think are the rules that Helen is saying we have to make more fair. So ultimately, I feel the same way about Helen's piece, I think that a lot of, racial minorities feel about affirmative action, which is that it's kind of a bigotry of low expectations.
Right. So what exactly is she calling for? That seems to be what I'm missing in all of this. What exactly are the changes that she would like to see happen in the workplace or in college admissions? Perhaps that could help us understand exactly what's at stake here.
No, okay. Well, I was just going to point out, for one thing, the piece is like 3,000 words, right? So I'd be judging this a lot harder if it were a book. I'd be pointing out, okay, where's this? But so there are two facets to what Helen adds. So one part of it is just the rules in general being more meritocratic, right? Saying we don't want to have diversity initiatives. We don't want to have. I glean from her writing. Again, she doesn't explicate it too much because it is a short piece. I gather, end the holistic admissions farce. And then she goes into discrimination law, some of which I think Rachel and I would agree with, and some of which I think we wouldn't, right? Like, I think getting rid of disparate impact in discrimination law is obviously an unambiguously good thing. Whereas, like, I think some gender protections, specifically as it pertains to, pregnancy, are probably good, because that is something that we cannot control for. That is one way in which obviously women are unique from men. But outside of that, it's a pretty biologically finite period of time that I don't think would make a huge difference, in terms of women's employment if you got rid of disparate impact protections versus pregnancy protections.
I would say that Andrews is primarily calling for an end to non-discrimination law, disparate impact, and so forth. But the reason she focuses on that is because her goal is not really advocacy for any particular policy end. Her primary goal is to pitch this particular kind of narrative that she thinks is going to appeal to a particular sort of audience. So I would say, if someone actually believed the things that Andrews is saying about women, our nature, what we are hardwired by biology to think and do, who would want one in their editorial room or their law firm? No reasonable employer would want to hire a woman if they believed the things that Andrew says about our natural tendencies and what's going to happen if any significant number of us make it in the workplace. So I think what she really wants, or at least is advocating for, is not really primarily cashed out on the level of policy. It's cashed out on the level of how we understand what men and women are and how she thinks they will naturally relate to one another in a world where we stop fooling ourselves about what men and women are.
Go ahead, Tiana.
So I can't speak to Helen's greater motivations, right? But I do know that Helen is not, even though she is definitely in the more protectionist, national conservative camp, she is, she is definitely in the right wing of social conservative policy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yet Helen is not someone I've ever seen spend any significant amount of energy doing what I see a lot of women on the right doing, and specifically women that were very critical of Helen's piece, which is shaming mothers for working, period, shaming mothers for using daycare, this weird Maha obsession with pretending that the birth control pill is somehow poisonous or carcinogenic, pretending that women aren't cut out for 9-to-5 employment. We've seen a lot of this in sort of like the trad wife trend, which I think is really more just aesthetic than anything. But there is kind of a pernicious and small but mighty faction in the right that has been very vocal about this. And Helen is not one of them. Helen has talked a lot about the fertility rate, but I think that's something we all care about. Being honest with women in terms of, the biological clock is real, and we know libs would like you to freeze your eggs when you're 20 and create 25 embryos. I think conservatives would maybe think, okay, well, things are a little bit more in your control. Maybe start closer to 30 than to 40. But I guess I don't see the vast sociological project as being to remove women from the workplace. And historically speaking, there wouldn't be much grounding for that either, right? I mean, women have in the English-speaking world, the best documentation we have is that the overwhelming majority of women, including mothers and wives, have worked for pay. And obviously, it looks a little different in the industrial era and in the pre-industrial era, but women have always been economic participants. They've not sat around all day homesteading, doing attachment parenting. They have been working in textiles, working in brewing, going back to the Middle Ages. We have guild information. I've written about this pretty extensively because it's a weird historical niche fascination of mine in medieval guilds, because we have really good employment data to work with. So I don't think the problem is women in the workplace. It is that if you give them a critical mass in leadership unfettered without considering how could we have bad instincts in the collective that change the rules, in the same way men in civilization had to learn trial by combat, actually, that's a terrible idea, right? Like, that was a thing that existed in the Western world for a very long time. And again, there's just far less allowance correctly for violence in the civilized world, whereas bullying and cancellation clearly has been weaponized into an official means of censoriousness. And so, again, I can't, maybe Helen's belief is the opposite of mine, in that if we applied men and women to the exact same rules, that women would, have a mass exodus out of the workplace. And honestly, I'm fine to see that play out, because my faith in women's abilities is that strong.
So Rachel, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, I think your objection to it is the sort of grand narrative problem that you see with this, that all of our institutions' problems are just the fault of women being women. Is that a fair way to characterize where you're coming from?
Yeah, and yes, definitely. I think so. Tiana seems to be moving towards a theory that I think is quite different from Andrew's that I find pretty sympathetic, actually, and pretty good for explaining many of the phenomena that Andrew's is talking about. So I think what you, Tiana, want to do is look at ways in which women in groups may sort of lean into some of their worst tendencies if they aren't encouraged and incentivized to discipline those. And you draw parallels to ways in which men sometimes behave badly if they're sort of permitted to do that, right? But can be taught to behave otherwise. So when you read about things like South Korea's very bad, right, workplace relations between men and women, and you read about all of these men who still think it's fine to grab women at dinners and make all these super sexist remarks and all this terrible behavior, and many of the women there seem to be of this view that, well, you can't train men not to do that. And I think women like us, Tiana, who have worked among American conservatives, we're regularly, I imagine this is true of you too, we are regularly one of the only women around the conference table or the only women at the dinner or something. Nobody behaves like that. Nobody
Correct.
does. Everybody knows you can't behave that way, right? So it's just not true that men can't learn not to behave like sexist pigs. And I think it's also not true that women can't learn that it's inappropriate to gang up on people, manipulate them, all the kinds of behaviors that Andrews is describing might be behaviors that women are prone to if you sort of allow them and encourage them, but you can train them to behave differently, and you need to, right? So that theory, I think, is very sympathetic, and I think I am very interested in exploring that theory. I just don't think that's what Andrews is doing at all. I think what Andrews is doing is leaning into a phenomenon that we are seeing in some other areas of the right, and especially the national and conservative right, which really has a lot less to do with trying to fix the problems with society right now. And I should say, I don't know her personally. You seem to know her. I'm just reading her and trying to piece together her theory based on what I read. But to me, this has a lot in common with other basically victim narratives that we see that seem to be geared primarily towards reassuring aggrieved groups that they are in fact naturally dominant, that their natural dominance has been stolen from them in illegitimate ways, and that we don't even need repressive laws to restore them, because the thing is they would naturally win anyway, right? They would win anyway if we just understood their natural superiority, and that I think is what the narrative is primarily aiming to do.
And
I'm not
just
sure. Go ahead,
to yes and that, that's why I think it's so important to not let this weird cultural obsession and nostalgia with the 1950s reign too supreme, especially in the conservative right. Because the 1950s were such a historical anomaly where you had peak, like automation, you had the return of men from World War II. It was the single lowest point of female labor force participation in probably 1,000 years. And I do see conservatives, especially social conservatives, really try and glorify it. And it's just not accurate. It's just not. It's just like women have always worked, and the majority of women have always worked for pay in some capacity, and it has not been at the detriment to men. And I think that is important. It's important to point out there is a massive difference between a large number of women working and a large number of women working and then changing the rules of engagement. And those are two different things. And, we can differ about how much we think Helen addresses that. But to your point, yes, I think it is important to not let that victim narrative take over.
Yeah, I think we agree on that. Yes.
Tiana, do you see any of these dangerous social undercurrents in this essay?
I think, again, I don't know if I see it in the essay. I agree broadly that we are being bombarded with victimhood grievance politics from all sides, and seemingly it feels like all corners, right? You see it in tariff policy, where the argument is that, the World Trade Organization and foreigners stole our jobs, so we need to tax American businesses in order to give money back to the workers. We see it with Zohran Mamdani, who has explicitly ran on a victimhood grievance campaign. Marxist jihadism is probably the closest way to put it. We see it with the whole disaffected young men phenomenon. where there are real things that are causing men to underperform in society that are not women girl bossing too hard. 1 in every 4 Gen Z boys has grown up without a father in the home. That is obviously catastrophic. Men need men, women need women, and women need men, and men need women. And specifically, children need their parents. I do think they're probably at the margins issues with schooling where, apparently PE and physical education and recess times have been dramatically cut over the last 20 years, and you spend much more time as a student behind a desk or worse, behind a screen, which I think boys probably biologically are less well equipped to deal with. And I wouldn't say that's wokeness, right? I don't think it's intentional in terms of favoring women so much as it is teachers' unions being lazy. So again, it's difficult for me to say because I feel like the essay has just been a giant Rorschach test where people have sort of seen what they want to see. And I'm trying to do a close reading of the text itself, where I don't see an entirely grievance-based politics there, because every cancellation or every mission creep Helen Andrews describes is accurate, right? At one point, she brings up doctors who were wearing, BLM or Free Palestine pins when seeing patients. And that obviously is a broader phenomenon that doesn't just have to do with gender. That has to do with the COVID shutdown, the subsequent BLM protests and riots, and I think a couple other issues that most people wouldn't assume have to do with wokeness. But I think one of my big hobby horses has been that zero interest rate policy in the decade after the Great Recession had a massive contributing factor, because investors were just trying to make money, and throwing money at things that sounded woke was a really good way to do it. And it's how you wound up with things like WeWork, right? That just blew up in VC faces.
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No.
I'm curious about something, because I would certainly agree with you about basically all the particular cases that she talks about. I think those are all bad cases of women behaving badly, right? I'm really more concerned about the fact that they seem both cherry-picked and characterized in such a way as to make it sound as though this is just the inevitable consequence of women in the workplace and not a particular example of women behaving badly. But instead of the question I want to ask, because I think we've kind of established our different positions on that, I get very concerned when she says things like what she says at the end of the piece, where she talks about giving this speech at the National Conservative Conference, and then she says, I was apprehensive about putting forward the Great Feminization thesis in such a public forum. It is still controversial, even in conservative circles, to say there are too many women in a given field, or that women in large numbers can transform institutions beyond recognition in ways that make them cease to function well. I made sure to express my argument in the most neutral way possible. To my surprise, the response was overwhelming. Okay, so I read that, and she says things like this sometimes. I've read this in other things. Oh, it's so difficult to stand up for this position. Oh, you're going to attract a lot of hatred if you do that. And I just think, in that setting, they will eat this up, and you know that. She is a very intelligent woman. When she makes a speech like this in that setting, she knows it's going to bring the house down. Do you really think when she says this kind of stuff to those audiences, there's any doubt in her mind that this is exactly the kind of thing they like to read?
Sure, in that setting, but the internet is forever, and the fact that we are talking about this right now is sort of a testament to the fact that it clearly was a controversial thing to say. Again, to me, it seemed kind of obvious, and I'm saying this as someone who was not a get back in the kitchen,
Right. But my concern, though, go ahead.
My piece is the only reason why I wrote my piece, because again, I thought I thought her piece was so obvious as to make it almost banal to say, yes, I agree with this. The only reason I wrote my piece was because every single piece I saw was a criticism of it, and not your piece in particular. I don't think your piece actually was too bad of an offender, but I did see a lot of people where I thought they were projecting far, far, far too much. Your criticism about whether or not it's a grand theory replacing other potential theories of wokeness, that I think is a little bit more actionable. The fact that this was written up in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, across the commentariat, viral on Substack, I mean, doesn't that kind of prove her point? Just a
I
little bit?
think, I think the reason this stuff gets the reaction that it gets is because many people are deeply alarmed that the right seems to be leaning into a particular kind of grievance politics that basically reassures the people who feel they should be dominant and are not, right? So there's a different kind of grievance politics that the right leans into, and I think they are afraid that that is becoming a very prominent part of the American right, that Andrews is an example of that, and I think they're absolutely right.
Okay, wait. Here's my counter question to both of you guys. Are you familiar who Erica Commissar is?
No.
So Erica Commissar, she describes herself as a psychoanalyst. I had never heard of her until about a year ago. And now she writes for the Wall Street Journal, just contributions. She's not a columnist. She's been on stage multiple times with Turning Point USA, does podcasts with Lila Rose, someone at this point that is pretty big in right-wing circles. Erica Commissar's entire argument is that if a woman leaves behind her child physically to do anything in the first 3 years of her child's life, she is traumatizing that child and giving them a dramatically higher risk of autism and ADHD. The argument is that at 1 year old, a woman can only spend 1 hour away from her child. So we're not even talking about, oh, you can't go into an office and work like I think, the majority of women do. But literally, if you're a stay-at-home mom and you go to the gym for 2 hours in one day, that is traumatic to an infant. The reason why I bring this up is because it's weird to me that Helen, who is not saying anything about the real ways in which policy or conservative preferences impact women on a day-to-day, she's talking about systems of employment and academia, that occupies all this airtime. And yet a woman who's on stage with Turning Point USA and interviewed by the most prominent pro-life activists in America saying that stay-at-home moms who go to lunch for 1 hour away from their newborn are traumatizing their newborns, let alone the rest of us working women who clearly are responsible for all the other kids with ADHD, right? That is why I'm just baffled by how is the Helen Andrews piece getting this much energy and not any of the other heinous crap that comes out of the mouths of some of these influencers who have far more cultural cachet than Compact Magazine.
Rachel, if I could push back on one point that you're making, and maybe you could clarify this for me. I didn't read Helen's piece as like a clash between the sexes. I didn't see it as her attempting to say men need to take their power back. It was more like she was saying this is why our institutions are falling apart. And so your answer here that there's an aggrieved, I understand that there is an aggrieved population that relishes this kind of thing and are really eager to hear it. But to me, I think I didn't agree with everything in it, but I think she's sincerely attempting to solve the problem of wokeness. How did this thing happen? Because it's in so many ways been so detrimental to our culture. What would be your reaction to that?
I think what's really important to me is to look at the implications of the ways in which Andrew characterizes womanhood and femininity. What is a woman and what does it mean to be feminine? So I think there's a certain kind of effectiveness to the sort of narrative that she's offering that you're not going to get from the kind of thing that Tiana is describing. That finds a certain kind of listener, right? But there's another kind of more intelligent listener that is far more fascinated by what I call the Nietzschean knockoff, right? One that's certainly more complex. But I think when you look at what Helen is saying about women, it's so degrading. it's such an insulting view of women, right? That she doesn't actually have to come back and present herself as offering a Mars and Venus sort of thing. Obviously, her view is going to be more persuasive to a lot of people if she claims that she's not doing that. But here's a point that I would make in thinking about these generally, these sorts of accounts generally. So I think actually through much of antiquity, there was a common view that men and women had basically the same telos, that is, they were moving towards similar excellences, but men were just a little better at it than women, right? Like men were a little bit more naturally excellent than women, but women still were sort of trying to achieve the same excellences, and they just weren't quite as good at it. But occasionally, you've got a really manly one who managed to actually kind of excel. I think that was actually a really common view through antiquity. Now, today's sort of whatever, traditionalists, reactionaries, social conservatives don't want to go there for a lot of reasons, but I think one of the reasons is because women have been so successful in competing with men that it's just not a plausible view anymore, and they want to persuade women not to compete with men, right? They want to move towards a world in which women don't spend their time competing with men. So if you want to do that, you need some kind of complementarianism, right? So you have to combine an account of excellences with some kind of account of, no, men and women actually are just very different from one another, far more different from one another than most people believed they were in antiquity. And so I think what Helen is doing is providing sort of a framework for a very robust complementarianism, wherein it's just not even fitting to have women striving for the same kinds of achievements and excellences that men strive for. They don't have that kind of nature, right? It's not in women's nature to be in those settings or to pursue those kinds of ends. And this is why she tells us if we have large numbers of women in these kinds of institutions, they're just going to wreck it. Again, I think she says it again and again. It doesn't matter how they get there. Cancel culture is simply what women do whenever there are enough of them in a given organization or field. The explanatory power of this simple thesis was incredible. It really did unlock the secrets of the era we are living in.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there because our Zoom meeting is running out. But this was a fantastic conversation. I hope I didn't get in the way too much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Rachel.